Liberty can be a counterintuitive idea to people, right? You have to do your research before you realize, oh yeah, this actually makes sense and it changes everything I previously knew about the world. And not a lot of people are going to make that realization. And so we're going to be a minority globally, but we can be a majority in one place.
On this episode of Liberty Curious, I sat down with Jason Sorens, senior research faculty at AIER, co-author of Freedom in the 50 States, and founder of the Free State Project, to discuss how much government interferes with our daily lives. Jason claims that adults should be treated like adults and not children, but the government often does the very opposite. We also talk about how to approach issues from a libertarian perspective, such as life-altering medical procedures for kids, hard drugs, tobacco, and where to draw the line on externalities. Jason also talks about the New Hampshire Free State Project and how liberty-oriented people can foster freedom at the local level.
Well, it's interesting because libertarians tend to be sympathetic to the anti-federalists because we see the gargantuan federal government of today and we think, yeah, there was a flaw in the design that ultimately led to this huge government. There's too much centralization of power. And there's some truth to that. But at the time, the anti-federalists tended to be, not exclusively, they were kind of a mixed bag, but a lot of them were much more populist. And they wanted states to be able to have paper money and have trade barriers and in other ways kind of manipulate their economies. And people like James Madison wanted a more free market, open trade, private property, sound money. And that's why he wanted a federal government that could check the states, which he saw as the big impediment to economic progress. So these debates don't really align fully with the kind of debates that we have today in the U.S.
Oh, that is very, very interesting. So, James Madison, was he more of what you would call a libertarian?
I think James Madison, libertarian might be an anachronistic term for the 18th century, but yeah, he was definitely a classical liberal. If you read, I think it's Federalist 10, where he talks about factions, and factions are what we would now call interest groups. And he says that the biggest problem from factions is that they will want to set up paper money. They'll want to abolish debts. They'll want to redistribute property. Right? So all his concerns were about excessive government involvement in the economy. So he wanted individual rights and free market policies. I think he was mistaken in thinking that the federal government was ultimately the big solution to that, and he himself in his lifetime actually changed his mind about that and became more of a states' rights type of person because he started to see the threat from the federal government. But yeah, he was definitely a classical liberal who favored strictly limited government.
Interesting. So back then it was basically like thinking that the states, maybe because they were actually closer to the individuals who held a lot of power and wealth, that they would kind of be able to distort things more and the federal government would be there to just kind of keep the checks and balances, whereas now it's kind of flipped.
Yeah, and you have to remember that in those days the average population of a state was something like, I don't know, 70,000 people, something along those lines. These were small. No state is that small now. And so his worry was that one group could end up taking control of the legislature and just do everything in their own interest, and it could be the farmers or it could be the merchants or whoever. So yeah, he was just worried that you would get kind of tyranny of the majority at the state level. And for that reason, he wanted to make sure that there was an open common market. And I think as libertarians now we can go back and look at that and say, you know what, he was right that an open common market is the solution there, because what that does is it actually checks state governments. So the reason we favor highly decentralized government where states have a lot of autonomy to set economic policy is that we actually want states to be held in check. And they're held in check by this process of competition, where now if we start to redistribute wealth, if we start to embark on crazy economic policies, if we get a lot of corruption, taxpayers are going to flee. They're going to go to other states. And that's only possible if we have a big open common market. And so that's the part of unifying the country that was the good part for libertarians, because it set up this more competitive model of federalism. And that's what undergirded our growth and economic development all the way up until the middle of the 20th century.
I think I know what you're leaning towards there, but what happened there that changed things?
Well, it's really the Great Depression and the New Deal and Supreme Court precedents that we still live under today that fundamentally changed the nature of the relationship between the federal government and the citizen. So now, essentially, if it's an economic issue of any kind, the courts are extremely reluctant to place any limits on Congress. So the federal government could pass any law that has to do with economics, and it's presumptively constitutional. That wasn't what the founders intended. That wasn't the way the Constitution was ever interpreted up until 1937, when the Supreme Court started to change positions on this and let a lot of these New Deal programs stand rather than overturn them as unconstitutional. So that changed things, because now the federal government is there to actually regulate the economy and even help states regulate the economy. So a lot of what states do is administer money that the federal government gives them, or enact regulations that the federal government incentivizes them to have. And so we don't have that competitive model of federalism as much anymore. We still have some of it, but we don't have as much of that where, states are autonomous, but they're also highly constrained, because you as the citizen have a lot of power. You can move from state to state, and that can really change your tax burden and the regulations that you face. Now it's much more uniform, because the federal government is ultimately in the driver's seat.
That's really been showcased in the last couple of years, right? Where you see there have been certain states that people have fled to. Right. And there's been like 3, Florida, Texas, or New Hampshire, basically, where people were like, okay, we want to get out of being under the thumb of this kind of COVID regime. So we're going to move here, there, or there. But that's, 3 states only, and, to varying degrees of freedom within those states. You're in New Hampshire. That's where you're located. Right. You're working on the Free State Project. So that's a really interesting thing. And I want to know a little bit more about that and kind of what the roots of the Free State Project are.
Yeah, I mean, the basic idea was, and I wrote an essay 22 years ago proposing this. I was a graduate student, and the basic idea was that classical liberals, libertarians, people who support strictly limited government, we can't make a big impact at the national level. It's just too big, too far away, too dominated by interest groups, billions and billions of dollars at stake in making sure that the status quo doesn't change. So as disappointing as it may be and as hard to accept as it may be, we're not going to have a big impact on Washington, D.C., but we could have a big impact in a single state, especially one that's small, has an open political process, and most importantly is already sympathetic to a lot of these ideals of individual freedom. And so I proposed this general idea. A lot of people signed up, and the first 5,000 people who signed up had the right to vote on which state we chose to be our new home. And the state that won that vote was New Hampshire, in part because the governor at the time, a guy named Craig Benson, supported the Free State Project and actually kind of lobbied us to choose New Hampshire. So of all the states we were considering, it was the only state where the governor really wanted us. Plus, it has the motto, live free or die. It has no general state sales tax, no general state income tax, no seatbelt law for adults, right? So it has this sort of more respect for private property, for individual freedom, individual choice, and that made it a great home for us. In addition, it turns out it has a really accessible political system. So it's the most decentralized state in America. That means that about 2/3 of our tax burden is decided at the local level, not the state level. Since there's no state sales tax or income tax, most of the revenue comes from local property taxes, actually. That goes to support schools and roads and police and fire. And the state only gives a little bit to local governments. So local governments have a lot of room to decide what they are going to budget and how much they're going to raise in taxes. So that makes it very accessible for the average citizen to really affect their tax burden. What makes it even more accessible is the fact that most of these towns still have the New England town meeting form of government. So you're directly voting on the budget. And each individual line in the budget is a different vote. And so if you get a town of people who want lower taxes, who want to be fiscally responsible, they can do that. They can have very low taxes and provide that kind of favorable environment for property owners. They can decide on local zoning, right? That's another local issue. And many towns in New Hampshire don't have zoning at all. So they allow property owners to do what they like with their property. So for those reasons, New Hampshire is really a kind of perfect place for people who favor limited government, individual freedom to get involved. And thousands of people have moved, and including myself, and have gotten elected, have changed legislation, and it's really made an impact in an area of the country that people perceive as being rather statist and left-wing. New Hampshire actually really stands out, and that's been a good model, actually. It's been a very clear contrast between, say, Vermont, Maine, and New Hampshire, all northern New England states. Mm-hmm. New Hampshire, by far, the most successful in terms of its economy, in terms of attracting people and investment, because of its free market policies.
Wow, that's really, really neat. I know people will often think about California or think about New York or think about kind of leftward states and make comparisons like that. But what about the red states? Like, what about, how do those compare to New Hampshire?
Yeah, so a lot of them have good economic freedoms. I'm thinking particularly of a lot of the kind of Midwestern states, the Dakotas, Nebraska, Idaho, Wyoming. A lot of those states have fairly low taxes, a fairly light regulatory touch, and they kind of have to because, well, if you're North Dakota, you're not going to get a lot of investment unless you have a really attractive policy environment for investment. So these states are not exactly booming, but they're doing very, very well given their climate, right? So if you compare the Dakotas to Minnesota, for example, Minnesota, blue state, has trended higher in terms of tax burden and crime rates and things like that. And the Dakotas have benefited from that, right? They're significantly outperforming Minnesota. Or if you look at Indiana, another relatively free red state right next to Illinois, and has significantly outperformed Illinois over the last 2 decades. People are getting out of Chicago all the time, and a lot of them move to Indiana, or they move elsewhere. And Indiana, by contrast, it's a state in the Rust Belt. It's on the Great Lakes. It doesn't have the advantages of Southern California or Florida or places like that. Yet it has a very good, high-performing economy because of its policies. So the red states do pretty well on some of the economic freedoms in general. With some exceptions, right? There are some red states that are not so good. I'm thinking of Kentucky and Mississippi. Some of these redder states have legacies of strong interest groups and even corruption that have impeded their ability to reform. But one area where red states tend to do worse, not always, but often, is personal freedom. So Texas, for example, does quite badly on personal freedom. They're one of the worst states on personal freedom. They're sort of a lock them up and throw away the key approach to criminal justice, even for so-called victimless crimes. They don't have the best gun policies in the country, actually. They have somewhat stricter gun regulations than a state like New Hampshire. And so you see more of a mixed bag in red states when it comes to those personal freedoms.
Those are kind of also consequentialist arguments, which we often use to kind of paint a picture for people of, what are the outcomes going to be if you do this policy or that policy. But I think it's also important to emphasize what the kind of the moral argument is sometimes, and you've spoken about this in your last piece that you wrote for AIER, which is treating adults like children. And I guess like the gist of all of that is, how much say should the government actually have in your life, in what you do? Because by putting out policies like that, or by making laws, about minimum wage, or even about things that you might not like transgender story hour, things like that they're looking at in Florida, right? I mean, the idea is, okay, maybe it's swinging in your direction now.
Right.
But when it swings in the other direction, are you going to be so happy, right? Like, what is the actual effect of government imposing a morality on people's individual choices?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the most important point to make there is that when government tries to enforce a private morality on people's personal lifestyle choices, they're treating citizens as if they were children. They're putting themselves in the position of a parent who can discipline a child. But adults are not children, and when you treat adults as if they were children, first of all, you violate their rights, you take away their legitimate freedoms. But second of all, you also stunt their moral growth, their ability to make these decisions for themselves, to make mistakes, to learn from them. In fact, even as a parent, you want that actually for your kids more and more as they get older, right? So I have a 9-year-old, an 11-year-old, and a 12-year-old. So I've seen this. As kids get older, you don't always want to prevent them from making bad decisions. You start to allow them to make some of those when they're not going to significantly affect the rest of the family, so that they can learn, because experience is the best teacher. So another way I like to think about this is, if we would not be okay with stepping in and forcing someone to make a particular choice as a private individual, what makes it okay for government, right? So if you see a stranger smoking a cigarette, would it be morally acceptable for you to run up to them and slap it out of their hand and grab their cigarettes and throw them in the garbage? Of course not. That would be wrong. You'd be violating their rights. So what makes it okay for strangers organized as the government to do that? There's really not a fundamental moral difference. Yes, there may be some cases where there's a loved one who may be, let's say, addicted or something like that. Could I intervene if my adult child were about to inject fentanyl into her veins? Yes, okay. In that case, in that kind of limited case, yes, I can see a moral argument for intervening, even if the child is an adult. But that's intervening with a loved one where you know the circumstances. The problem is, government doesn't know the circumstances of every situation, right? So actually, it's worse when government intervenes than when private individuals intervene in people's lives, because the government just has a kind of blank, uniform approach to everything that cannot take account of how a person is going to react and respond to this stimulus. So if I think I can help a friend or a loved one turn their life around, I can intervene. But government isn't going to be able to know how to do that in an effective way. They can throw people in jail, they can tax people, but that's not the kind of approach that's needed to actually help someone make a better lifestyle choice. So really, at the end of the day, it's very, very difficult to make a case that government should be controlling people's private lifestyle choices.
Yeah, that's really well said, Jason. And you talk about in your piece here, Treating Adults Like Children, you cite how New Zealand recently passed a law permanently prohibiting the sale of tobacco to anyone born on or after January 1st, 2009. So if you're unlucky enough to have been born on or after that date, it will forever be illegal for you to smoke a cigar on a celebratory occasion or to savor a pipe on a dewy summer evening. But Jason, what could we do if the government wasn't there to teach us how to be healthy? What would we do?
Yeah, I mean, we'd I guess always make terrible decisions, right? But in fact, I mean, the point I wanted to make there is that morality and prudence in your own life can be a complex and subtle thing. You know what? Tobacco use isn't always wrong, right? Sometimes it can be enjoyable and perfectly fine, in the same way that occasionally eating ice cream can be perfectly fine and good, right? And something that people should do, right? And so when we set up a law that has one uniform rule for everyone, we cannot take into account all those individual circumstances. And we, again, forfeit our moral judgment, that sometimes difficult process of figuring out when and where a certain activity is appropriate. We forfeit that to a simple act of obedience to avoid getting into trouble, right? And that does not develop our character. It doesn't develop our judgment, and at the end of the day, it makes us unhappy and unable to sort of enjoy some of the good things of life.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And it actually brings me to think about an article that I read the other day, and you'll appreciate this as well, probably as a parent. It's an author named Janet Lansbury, and she has a podcast called Unruffled, and she writes articles basically about respectful parenting, which is, putting limits up for your children, but also offering them choices and allowing them space to fail, as well as you're saying, at appropriate times, ensuring that they're safe in doing so and that it's not going to have these huge consequences on them or the family. And she talks about how a colleague of hers had a kindergarten program, or a preschool program, actually. And she had a transfer of students. For some reason, one of these schools closed, and this transfer of a group of students came into her class, and her style was, these are 4-year-olds, 5-year-olds, so it's kind of free play, like letting them explore and kind of figure out the situation. But these 4-year-olds had previously been at a school where they were already sitting in desks and being told what to do and being taught down to, and how to behave and how to be conformist, essentially. And we see that, Janet's point was that we see this now at an earlier and earlier age within the education system and within even kind of a daycare system. And so do you think that kind of way of looking at education from an early age onwards has repercussions as well in the way that Americans go about their life and thinking that they need somebody to kind of tell them how to live?
I do think so, and sometimes there is a place for conformity, right? So, some workplaces couldn't operate, right, if people didn't follow certain rules, weren't able to take orders and manage their day. And yes, there's some role for the school system in acclimating students to that kind of environment, but the problem is our education system is all the way on the other extreme, where it's all conformity, it's all pleasing the teacher, right? And being able to sit still and be quiet. And that just doesn't work for a lot of kids. And I think this is one reason why we see, for instance, that boys are having trouble in America and are less likely to succeed in high school, less likely to go to college at all, and if they do, less likely to graduate. Because often they are the ones who have more trouble sitting still and being quiet and being conformist and obeying the teacher all the time. So it doesn't work for everyone, and our school systems usually are not teaching independent thought and creativity and your ability to make choices and deal with the consequences and take ownership, right? So these are things that I think we need to have more of in the school system so that kids are able, as adults, to think more for themselves and exercise independent judgment and question authority when necessary, right? So I do worry about that. I do worry that a lot of people, a lot of adults in our society have this sense that, well, if you get in trouble with the law, you probably deserve it, and where that may come from, back in the recesses of their mind, is from their experience as a child in a classroom where the teacher dispensed favors and punishments based on some inscrutable wisdom from above. And people imagine the government is like that, but it's not at all. It's just people, some of whom are public spirited, some of whom are not, some of whom are competent, and many of whom are not at all.
Yeah.
And they often make bad decisions, and injustices happen to good people.
Yeah, no, that makes so much sense. In your article as well, you talk about how, now they're moving in some states, even like California, to ban tobacco completely, whereas they're opening up marijuana laws and things like that. And I remember watching a documentary many years ago about the prohibition of marijuana and how at that time it ended up hurting a lot of innocent people who were just sent to jail. Just for having possession of, personal consumption and things like that. So why do we see then, like, in your opinion, that things like marijuana are becoming legalized, but things like tobacco are now being frowned upon? Is that just because of the moral judgment? Are there other incentives there maybe that politicians have to ban these kinds of things? Like another example is vaping laws. Like what's going on there?
Yeah. Well, I think the primary cause of this sort of hypocritical treatment of marijuana and tobacco is ideology, right? And the culture war. So people who smoke tobacco, they're probably not college educated. They're probably not very progressive. They may not think the right things about pronouns. Right? And so smokers are an outgroup, and we can hurt smokers of tobacco. But marijuana, that's progressive. That's creative. Artists do that. And so we want to be good progressives and liberals and respect these people. And so, yes, marijuana is being elevated, not because of, unfortunately, any idea of respecting people's private choices or their property rights, but instead simply that we approve of marijuana more, which I think is exactly the wrong reason to legalize it. And we disapprove of tobacco more, so we're going to start regulating that more and more. It's unfortunate that that's the case, but it seems as if people's approval and disapproval of choices is driving their support for either legalizing or banning things. And again, that is an abdication of our moral judgment of understanding that even if something isn't prohibited, it may not be a good idea, and I need to think that through.
Yeah. And actually, if we take that example a little bit further to something more extreme, we can think about opioids and fentanyl and street drugs, like San Francisco, what's going on there with that whole thing. So there's very kind of liberal laws around those things. And beyond it just being liberal, though, because maybe some Republicans will argue, well, you need to ban these substances, but it's not just the substances themselves, but it's actually the incentives for people to use those substances and the enablement of their addictions, right? That's kind of leading to the kind of state of affairs in places like San Francisco. What do you think, like coming from a classical liberal or libertarian viewpoint about hard drugs? Like, how should that be dealt with?
Yeah. So hard drugs should be, in my opinion, lawful for consenting adults. So it's ultimately a matter of rights over your person, that you have self-ownership in your person, and of property rights, right? These are substances that if you purchase them voluntarily, then you own them and you can do what you like with them, so long as you're not harming others. But at the same time, we should be very careful about children or people who may not be consenting or of the ability to consent. We need to have strong protections for children. We need to have strong protections for public spaces, right? And so this gets us to the problem of San Francisco, right? When people are unsafe because because others are abusing drugs in public, or even just making public spaces annoying and uncomfortable. Like you have to walk through clouds of marijuana smoke on the streets of New York sometimes these
that's
days.
like externalities, right? Like that's a question
right.
too. How much does, somebody's, but that argument can be applied to carbon emissions, what is the role for dealing with externalities and things that actually are affecting other people outwardly, because those arguments are tricky because then they can be used for things, like CO2 emissions and not just walking through an encampment filled with marijuana smoke and needles, right?
Yeah. So the formula should be significant, direct, negative externalities, right? So if I'm imposing something that's a true harm on you, if I'm certainly if I'm invading your nose and your lungs, right, then I think that is something that that is an actual harm that could be actionable in a court of law, right? If it's if there's some distress that happens as a result of that, or some medical effects. And so I actually do think that air pollution is an example where the libertarian approach actually supports strong environmental regulations when they deal with things that cause true health problems for people, right? So if you are polluting other people's lungs, you're invading their space and you're causing a significant direct harm to them, and they can legitimately sue you for that. Or if that's not a viable option, we can have some regulatory framework to deal with that. Actually, that framework is helpful. But if you think about everything as an externality and just open that up, anytime there's any kind of externality, government can get involved. Then yes, then you go off the reservation, and you could end up endorsing policies that cause significant harm to deal with something very minor that people could handle themselves voluntarily, right?
Well, that's where it gets really tricky, and actually a perfect example. I just saw a comment still to this day on Twitter, like yesterday or the day before. Still to this day, people are talking about how you don't have a right to infect people with a virus. Right. So like you don't have a right to go out there without a mask, and breathe on people. So it becomes really tricky. Like, where do you draw the line with those kinds of externalities and policy?
That's right. So to me, common sense says that, I don't have a right, if I know that I have COVID or some infectious disease, to walk up to you and intentionally infect you with it, right, without your consent, right? But when we're talking about requiring people to wear masks in public spaces without any proof that they have the disease, then we're doing something called prior restraint. We're saying there's some small chance that you might be posing some small risk to someone indirectly, and that's what's going to cause us to control you. That is unjustifiable, right? Because there we end up with intolerable restrictions on our ability simply to live our lives. So we could say in the same way, well, you're having a beer at home. Well, there's some small chance that then that could impair your faculties to the extent that you go out and get in a car and drive and hit somebody and harm them. So we're going to ban beer, right? So the same sorts of logic could ultimately end up constraining all of our choices to such an extent that life isn't worth living anymore, right? So it really has to be you can't intentionally cause direct harm to people, and that's what we can control. But we can't control all these minor risks that don't actually cause fear to anyone, because they are small enough and indirect enough, that really at the end of the day, it's shouldn't be a factor in our choices and in our sense of well-being, right? If I'm being kind of neurotic and unreasonable if I'm crippled by fear that someone out there might have an infectious disease that I'll get, right? That's not a healthy mentality to have, and our legal framework should encourage a more kind of healthy approach to our interactions with people, because we need to interact with people. This is where human progress comes from, is voluntary interactions, and we need a framework that encourages that, without taking away people's ability to make a wide range of choices about what kind of life they want to lead.
I've been reading a couple of good books lately, and a lot of them kind of come from a different era. So Hayek's Road to Serfdom is one of them, and Viktor Frankl's Man in Search of Meaning. And what I'm finding in those pieces of literature is that there's these similarities that I can kind of draw on when a society is swinging very collectivist, right? Where, they've decided that the rights of the majority supersede those of the minority or those of the individual, where people have to make these sacrifices for the greater good. And I wonder if this is something that, happens in cycles where people tend to think more that way. And then, they realize after things have gotten very bad that, oh, maybe, we do need to focus on individual liberty again. And so that kind of becomes more popular. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, in general, are these tendencies that result from a collectivist framework?
I think so. I think actually human beings have a collectivist framework sort of innately based on the kind of environment that our ancestors lived in for hundreds of thousands of years, which was a small-scale collectivist group. And right in a hunter-gatherer society, the people you live with, they're your family, right? And families are not just anonymous sort of transactional environments. They're places where you support each other and where there's some ability also to try to affect each other's choices, right? And so there's a little more scope for group action within a family than in a kind of group of anonymous strangers, right? So that collectivist framework, a lot of people now want to apply to society, right? They make that inference that, well, I wish society were more like a family. It's a grave error, as Hayek realized, that in the Great Society, precisely what allows us to progress and have cooperation across people who don't know each other is that it's very minimal, right? I don't have to know your life story. You don't have to know mine. I don't have to care about your dog and your love life and your kids to buy a product from you, right? And vice versa. And if we did have to care about each other to that extent and get involved in each other's lives to that extent, we couldn't carry out all these little transactions that make up a modern economy and that have allowed our standard of living to progress and our lifespans to expand very greatly over our prehistoric past. So in the Great Society, we should not think of that as a family. We should think of it as kind of arena where people can interact with kind of a neutral playing field, very simple rules for us all basically just to get along. A family should work by different rules. But I do think that collectivists have that kind of emotional appeal, that model of the family, of equality, of care, of some degree of paternalistic control, right, of your lifestyle choices, and this appeals to a lot of people just innately, And so we have to keep learning that lesson over and over again that, oh yeah, no, that doesn't work when we try to extend it beyond the family to larger groups. And so unfortunately, I think we're at a point of history right now where we have to learn that lesson again. It's been, 30 years since communism fell in Europe, and a lot of young people don't have that lesson that socialism doesn't work and it causes misery and despair and slavery, and so they're advocating some of these ideas that we know will not work and that will take away people's rights and freedoms, and we're just going to have to learn some of these lessons over again.
Yeah. Yeah. Unfortunately, I tend to agree with you there. But, there's another thing in there as well, which is that I don't know if families, I think, do operate, with looking out for each other. And I've had this debate with a friend of mine on multiple occasions. But do you not think as well that tends to also trickle out into society?
Mm-hmm.
Like, for example, you were talking about your children before and how you allow them choices within boundaries, right? Like, not
Right.
saying this is a free-for-all, like, libertine family, but there are certain boundaries there, and you respect your children and you allow them that kind of leeway. And in doing so, you're kind of building this this relationship with them where it's not an authoritarian paternalistic relationship. It's like authoritative versus authoritarian. And
Mm-hmm.
do you not think that maybe that kind of trickles out to society, and that because that's not necessarily the norm in how people bring up their families, they tend to kind of repeat things intergenerationally as well in cycles. That's why we also see a majority that tends to be kind of very tribal and collectivist, because that's how they interact within their family. Like, there's a lot of control, unhealthy
I
control.
I think you're right, and maybe I would reconcile the points this way. I think the reason why a more kind of rationalist, if you will, approach to parenting, where you're helping children develop their decision-making authority and the ability to think for themselves, the reason why that makes sense in our society is precisely that. We want our kids to grow up to be adults who can function in a society where they're not going to be always taken care of, right? There's not always going to be someone there to watch over them, and if they were to try to rely on that through the government, we would consider that to be a failure, right? We would consider that to be disappointing or at least regrettable. We could put it that way. If you do look at more traditional societies, often parenting is more authoritarian, right? Arranged marriages and, female circumcision and all sorts of things that are aimed at precisely at controlling their children's lives. And maybe the reason that parenting style was so popular in those societies was that the broader society did not prize independent judgment, initiative, tolerance, thinking for yourself, right? That these
Freedom.
were not things, right? That freedom was not available in the broader society or valuable, and so the authoritarian parenting style could survive and kind of maybe make sense within that framework. So I do think, you're right. We should raise our kids to be freer thinking, but precisely because our society still is largely and should be one that prizes freedom.
One of the things that I've been wondering about, and I don't know the answer to, and I would love to get your opinion on, is how do you deal with things like we see right now that there's the kind of trans activist agenda that's playing out, which may be different for children and adults, right? There's a distinction there, but it has really kind of swallowed up the sphere of children. And we see that there's a lot of outcry. People are really resisting that. So, things like anywhere from drag queen story hour in schools or in public libraries or things like that to surgeries and hormones and drugs that are life altering and maybe even deadly. Like a recent article came up about these things going very wrong for children. So how do you deal with that kind of from a classical liberal or libertarian perspective?
So I think with all these issues, we have to draw that distinction between what's a right and a good choice and what is a choice that should be required by law, right? There may be examples like Drag Queen Story Hour where many parents might reasonably believe this is something I'd rather my child were not exposed to, right? I don't want my child to be super confused about the adult world and what that's going to be like when they grow up and confused about their sexuality, right? And maybe to some small degree, a Drag Queen Story Hour might cause some of that confusion. And so that's a reason why I don't want my kids to participate in that. Should government ban Drag Queen Story Hour by law? Well, to me, that requires a showing then that you're causing some significant permanent harm to these kids by exposing them to this. And I think that case is unproven. Now, maybe you could do some scientific research to show that, right? And so that's, these gray areas are where actually data does matter, right? So we don't know always exactly what's going to cause significant harm to children and where that legal boundary should be drawn. And possibly we could draw it in a different place depending on what we find out. But just intuitively, it seems that these are the sorts of things that maybe parents with certain cultural values might want to expose their kids to, and the rest of us might see that as sort of odd and maybe not great, but in the interests of allowing for the autonomy of the family, we're not going to say, we're going to go take your kids away from you, or we're going to try to prohibit these kinds of things from ever happening. On the other hand, you get invasive interventions like hormone treatments and surgeries for kids. And there, I think, a libertarian or anyone would have to say kids can't necessarily make their own choices about these kinds of permanent, life-altering decisions, right? These changes. So there is potentially a very strong role for the legal system in preventing these things from happening, at least until the age of majority when they can make these decisions for themselves. So that's kind of how I tease out that difference.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important distinction. And another thing as well about teaching kind of gender ideology in schools, at very young ages, like maybe could a case be made that we don't ban this outright, because coming back to your first argument about Drag Queen Story Hour, we don't ban it outright, but it should not be within the hands of the state. So it shouldn't be in public schools, and people should have a choice as to whether they want their children to be exposed to this or not. Like, could that be a case to be made?
That's right. And this is the problem when you have government education, is that there's always going to be a battle over what values government is promoting in that education. And it's not possible for government to be completely neutral among values, right? They're going to be promoting one set of values versus another, regardless of the approach that they take. They're either going to be saying, hey, your religious views about these lifestyles are out of place because we want to, allow all of these things to happen within the school. Or they're going to be saying, no, we're going to endorse the concerns of, say, morally conservative or religious people about these lifestyles. We're not going to allow these lifestyles. And so we're making a decision about lifestyle, about beliefs as a government. And that's not okay. So I really think there's a strong argument to be made for not having government management of educational institutions, because that's the only way you can be neutral among all these competing values is at most to have say, government funding to the parents, where they can then decide on what type of private institution they want to educate their kids in. And then those private institutions can decide what sort of values and what sort of code they're going to require their students to live by.
Right. And then you have kind of like a free market school system, right? Where the market actually decides kind of who wins, and the ideas and the schools and the curriculums that end up being more popular are the ones that you're going to see more of. And that will just kind of sort out the ideological tendencies in society, to go one way or another. And it will actually become more apparent what people actually want. Because I think that a lot of these ideologies that are being espoused in school are coming from the top down. They're not necessarily coming from the bottom up and representing what people actually want for their children.
Absolutely. The truth is, we don't know what parents actually want for their kids in the public schools, because there's no mechanism for that to be decided on other than political fighting, right? But instead of political fighting, if we just allowed people to vote with their dollars, then we'd probably get a much more sensible mix of policies that are going to work to help parents and their kids.
Yeah. And so in New Hampshire, do you have more school choice?
We do. We haven't adopted yet the universal school choice model that some states are now starting, but we do have several forms of school choice. Some towns don't have their own public schools, so they can give money to parents and let them choose a private school. So those towns can have full school choice, actually. Some towns do have public schools, and in those towns, you still have available a state program for school choice where up to 300% of the federal poverty level, parents can get a check from the government to pay for either homeschool or private school expenses. We also have a tax credit scholarship program that provides additional support for homeschool and private school tuition. So we have a lot of school choice options, and those are becoming more popular every year.
Okay, cool. So just to kind of wrap it up, because we're running out of time, this has been a really rich conversation, so thank you. Just thinking about, my last question for you, I guess, Jason, would be, we talked about collectivism and how that tends to be kind of a generational thing going way and way and way back, like those kind of tendencies. And I think I saw a tweet put out by you or somebody else from the New State Project saying, part of the reason of having this project and having one state where you kind of allow these things to play out and you invite liberty-oriented people to come live is because it's not necessarily pragmatic to think that you're going to change the whole country or the whole world with ideas of liberty. So let's take all of the people who actually hold these values and say, hey, why don't we all live next door?
Right. Yeah. Liberty can be a counterintuitive idea to people, right? You have to do your research before you realize, oh yeah, this actually makes sense and it changes everything I previously knew about the world. And not a lot of people are going to make that realization. And so we're going to be a minority globally, but we can be a majority in one place. And furthermore, isn't it great to be around people who you know for a fact, regardless of what you may disagree with them about on matters of society or religion or whatever, they're always going to respect your rights. At minimum, that is the thing that you can be confident in. That's really important.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And so do you think then that it will continue that way and that it's always kind of been that way where really liberty-minded people are kind of a minority in society?
I think so. I mean, you can go back to times in American history where it seems like the majority of people definitely had a skepticism of government. So if you go back to, say, 1900, there was a lot of pride in not being on welfare, for example, and we didn't have significant national welfare programs. There was a lot of private mutual aid that happened instead. So definitely you could say that people were a lot more liberty-minded maybe back in 1900 than they are today. But I still wouldn't say that they had any kind of deep philosophical commitment to the principles of individual liberty.
Mm-hmm,
People are,
mm-hmm. Well,
yeah,
yeah, you look at the French Revolution, like people were
yeah.
very anti-government didn't mean that they were necessarily pro-freedom.
Well, that's right. That's right. And people may, as we know from our history, people may support freedom for that group, but obviously not that group, right? So
Yeah.
we've dealt with that forever.
Yeah, so a libertarian, classical liberal kind of supports freedom for all individuals, the smallest minority. So, any last thoughts, Jason, before we wrap up?
Well, thank you, Kate. It's been a pleasure to speak about why government should leave people alone to make their own private choices and learn from them. And I don't know. I hope that that some of these countries like New Zealand will rethink what they're doing, because if we continue down this path, it's going to be pretty crazy that fairly harmless, innocuous choices are going to be prohibited simply because they might be damaging to our health. That sets a dangerous precedent.
Yes, absolutely. So I encourage our viewers to go check out your article, Treating Adults Like Children, and they can follow you on Twitter, read your work at AIER.org. Once again, thanks so much for joining me today here, Jason, and hope to talk to you again soon.
Thank you, Kate.